A successful white millionaire took a DNA test for fun, never expecting it would change his life forever. The results revealed he had a twin sister he never knew about, a black woman who had been searching for her birth family for years. Even more shocking, she was the owner of his biggest business competitor. Now they must navigate their newfound relationship while merging their rival empires. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Julian stared at the email, the stark black text blurring through a sudden film of unshed tears. His perfectly ordered world, a symphony of crisp white shirts and meticulously planned schedules, had just been shattered. A twin sister. The words echoed in the sterile silence of his minimalist penthouse. The city lights a mocking glitter against the darkness closing in on him. The opulent apartment, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt suffocating. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. The DNA test, a frivolous whim, a fleeting moment of curiosity, had detonated a bomb in his meticulously crafted life. He picked up his phone, the cool glass a stark contrast to the burning heat in his chest. Anya's name, a name he barely knew, felt alien yet familiar, a ghost whispering on the edge of his consciousness. He hesitated, fingers hovering over the call button. He didn't know what to expect, what to say. This wasn't a business deal. This was family. The idea felt surreal, terrifying, and strangely compelling all at once. The weight of his privilege pressed down on him, a heavy cloak of guilt. His life, a gilded cage of success, felt suddenly hollow, insignificant in the face of this revelation. He thought of the countless times he'd dismissed the struggles of others, his success blinding him to the systemic inequities that shaped the world. Now, staring into the abyss of his own previously unknown past, he was forced to confront his own complicity. He was rich, white, and successful, and completely oblivious to half of his own being. The chasm between his life and the life of his twin sister, a black woman struggling to compete in a world stacked against her, felt unbridgeable, a canyon carved by privilege and prejudice. He took a deep, shaky breath. He had to try. He had to reach out. The phone rang, a jarring shriek in the suffocating silence of Julian's penthouse. He flinched, the smooth obsidian surface of the phone cold against his trembling fingers. He stared at Anya's name, the stark contrast between the simple elegance of the digital display and the chaotic storm within him stark. He took a breath, the city lights blurring through the panoramic window, a glittering, indifferent backdrop to his inner turmoil. He answered, his voice a strained whisper. "Hello." Anya's voice, rich and husky, filled the space. "Julian." There was a wary hesitation in her tone, a carefully constructed wall around a vulnerability he could sense even through the phone. "Yes," he replied, the word catching in his throat. He cleared it, trying for a confidence he didn't feel. It's me, from the DNA test." Silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city. He could almost hear her breathing, a slow, measured rhythm on the other end of the line. The weight of unspoken accusations hung between them, a palpable tension he could physically feel. Finally, Anya spoke, her voice low and controlled. "I received your message. I don't understand. How is this possible?" A faint tremor betrayed the composure she was attempting to maintain. He could picture her, sitting in her sleek, modern office, the sharp lines of her workspace a reflection of her own fiercely independent spirit. I don't know," Julian admitted, the words tumbling out, raw and unfiltered. "I'm as shocked as you are. I never imagined." He trailed off, the enormity of the situation crushing him. The scent of expensive coffee, usually a comforting aroma in his penthouse, now felt sickly sweet, a mocking reminder of the privileged life he'd taken for granted. He ran a hand through his hair again, the gesture betraying his anxiety. "Imagined what?" Anya's voice sharpened, her guardedness slipping, replaced by a cautious curiosity laced with deep-seated suspicion. The scent of old leather and polished wood, from her childhood memories, flooded his mind, a stark contrast to his sterile apartment. imagined that I had a twin sister, a sister who owns my biggest competitor." The words hung in the air, a confession laden with guilt and a dawning understanding of the immense injustice of their parallel lives. The sleek lines of his modern art collection seemed to mock him, highlighting the stark difference between their realities. The realization that his success was built, in part, on a foundation of ignoring the very existence of his twin sister sent a shiver down his spine. The weight of his privilege, usually a source of comfort, now felt like a crushing burden. He had to do better. He had to try. The silence stretched, a tangible thing between them, thick with unspoken accusations and the ghost of a shared past they didn't yet understand. The city lights, a glittering tapestry outside Julian's panoramic window, felt remote, indifferent to the turmoil raging within him. He could almost taste the metallic tang of fear on his tongue. Anya's voice, when it finally came, was a carefully controlled tremor. "My father. You mentioned something about our father?" The question hung in the air, fragile as a butterfly's wing. Julian swallowed, the lump in his throat constricting his breath. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the expensive cashmere of his robe scratching against his skin, a jarring contrast to the rough, raw emotion he felt. "Yes," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the city. There's a lot you need to know." He described his life, the carefully constructed facade of success crumbling with each word. The lavish parties, the prestigious deals, the glittering accolades, all felt hollow, meaningless against the stark reality of his newly discovered sister's existence. A life lived in a world he'd never known. He spoke of his parents, their choices, the carefully constructed lies that had separated them. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, pregnant with unspoken pain. Julian imagined Anya, surrounded by the cool, minimalist elegance of her office, the sharp lines a reflection of her fiercely independent spirit. He imagined the weight of her silent anger, the years of unanswered questions, the loneliness that must have gnawed at her soul. "So," Anya finally said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet laced with a simmering intensity that Julian could feel through the phone. "You knew nothing. Absolutely nothing." The accusation wasn't angry, not yet. It was a statement of fact, a cold, hard truth that chilled Julian to the bone. He couldn't deny it. The guilt was a physical weight in his chest, pressing down on his lungs. "No," he admitted, the single word a confession of a lifetime of privilege built on ignorance. I didn't know." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He closed his eyes, the worlds apart in their surroundings. One image showed a smiling Julian, impeccably dressed, at a lavish birthday party. The other, a younger Anya, her eyes bright with a fierce determination that belied her age, playing in a sun-drenched park. "He looks so content," Anya murmured, her voice barely a whisper, tracing the outline of Julian's small face with a fingertip. The unspoken contrast hung heavy in the air. Julian, sitting opposite her, nodded slowly. The casual elegance of his usual attire was replaced by a quiet vulnerability. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying a turmoil that his carefully constructed facade usually concealed. "And you look strong," he said, his gaze lingering on Anya's youthful image. Even then, a wave of bittersweet nostalgia washed over Anya. The memory of that park, a sanctuary in her otherwise chaotic childhood, brought a pang of both longing and fierce independence. "I had to be," she replied, her voice gaining strength. Survival wasn't a choice. The words hung in the air, stark and revealing. Silence settled between them, filled only with the gentle hum of the city outside and the quiet rustle of the turning pages. The shared history depicted in those photographs was a bridge, but also a chasm, a testament to the privileges Julian had been born into and the hardships Anya had overcome. Julian reached across the desk, his hand covering hers for a fleeting moment. The contact was electric, a silent acknowledgement of their shared past, their contrasting present, and the uncertain future they were building together. He cleared his throat, the sound betraying his apprehension. I want to understand, he began, his voice thick with emotion. I want to know what it was like for you, growing up. Anya looked at him, a mixture of wariness and a flicker of trust in her eyes. The weight of her unspoken stories pressed down on her. The emotional toll of years of solitude, of fighting for every inch of success in a world that seemed determined to hold her back, finally found a voice in the quiet intensity of her gaze. The merger of their companies, she realized, was only the beginning of a far more profound reconciliation. A reconciliation of their fractured past and the uncertain healing of their fractured family. The mahogany boardroom felt suffocating, the polished surface reflecting the strained faces gathered around it. Anya's gaze, sharp and unwavering, met Julian's across the table. The air hung thick with suspicion, the scent of expensive coffee doing little to mask the underlying tension. A leaked document, detailing a potentially illegal merger tactic, had shattered their fragile alliance. It had to be someone inside, Julian said, his voice low, his usual confidence replaced by a simmering anxiety. The fluorescent lights hummed, a discordant counterpoint to the silence that followed. He rubbed his temples, the weariness etched deep in his face. Anya leaned back, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm against the table. The expensive tailored suit she wore couldn't disguise the simmering anger within. And you think it was one of my people? Her voice was ice, each word carefully measured. The accusation hung in the air, a barbed arrow aimed directly at the heart of their fragile truce. Julian flinched, the unspoken question of trust hanging heavy between them. He'd placed his faith in Anya, a risky gamble given their history, and now the gamble was teetering on the edge of ruin. The betrayal felt like a personal affront, a violation of the tentative connection they had begun to forge. I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw with frustration. But someone close to both of us knows the details. Someone who had access. He stared at the leaked document, a physical manifestation of the breach in their trust. The crisp paper felt alien in his hand, a jarring reminder of the shattered harmony. Anya's eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, a familiar burden of suspicion and betrayal. Years of navigating a cutthroat business world had taught her to trust no one, least of all someone who had once been her enemy. Yet, a flicker of doubt, a tiny seed of hope, struggled against the ingrained cynicism. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against their already fragile peace. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, simmering resentments, and the chilling possibility that the betrayal could unravel everything they'd worked so hard to build. The opulent setting couldn't hide the stark reality. Their shared dream hung precariously on a thread. The mahogany gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting Anya's furious frown. The leaked document felt like a physical blow, a betrayal not just of their business, but of the fragile trust they'd painstakingly built. The scent of expensive coffee couldn't mask the bitterness in the air. Julian watched her, the lines of exhaustion etched deeper into his face than usual. He'd always relied on logic, on meticulous planning, but this felt chaotic, personal. It wasn't me, he said, his voice rough, the words a low plea. He saw a flicker of something in Anya's eyes, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps a glimmer of doubt. He needed that doubt to take root. Anya's gaze, however, remained wary. She picked up a crystal decanter, the weight of it grounding her amidst the storm. Easy for you to say, Julian. You had everything to gain, everything to lose. The ice in her voice was sharper than any blade. Her fingers tightened around the decanter, the crystal cool against her skin, a small comfort against the burning anger. The accusation hung heavy, unspoken but palpable. Julian flinched. Her words were a mirror to his own fears, reflecting his own anxieties about the depth of her mistrust. He was a stranger to her, really, despite their shared DNA. A wealthy, privileged stranger who'd suddenly appeared in her life, disrupting her carefully constructed world. He understood her anger, he deserved it. He pushed away from the table, the movement jarring in the tense silence. The polished wood felt cold beneath his palms. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. "But finding out who did this, that's the only way we can fix this. Together." The word "together" hung in the air, a fragile bridge across a chasm of suspicion and hurt. Anya looked at him, her expression unreadable. The weight of their shared past, of their fractured family history, their bitter rivalry, pressed down on them both. The silence stretched, pregnant with the unspoken question. Could they truly trust each other enough to navigate this crisis? The fate of their empires, and perhaps something more profound, rested on the answer. The air in Anya's office, usually vibrant with the energy of her team, felt thick with suspicion. The scent of jasmine, her favorite, was overpowered by the metallic tang of fear. Julian sat opposite her, the polished mahogany table a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within them. He watched her fingers trace the rim of a chipped teacup, the delicate porcelain a fragile echo of their precarious alliance. "I understand your anger," Julian began, his voice soft, a stark contrast to the booming confidence she usually associated with him. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the silence. "But this leak, it benefits neither of us." Anya's gaze remained fixed on the cup, her silence a heavy curtain. The faint clinking of ice in her glass was the only sound, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her heart. She finally looked up, her eyes dark pools reflecting the dim office light. "Benefits? Julian, this could destroy everything we've built. And you know it." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. He leaned forward, the gesture hesitant, vulnerable. "I know," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "And I'm as determined as you are to find out who's behind this. We need to work together, Anya. This isn't just about our businesses anymore. It's about us." He winced at the word, the unspoken weight of their complicated relationship hanging between them like a tangible thing. The unspoken question remained. Could they truly trust each other, despite the gnawing doubt and the ghost of betrayal that hung between them? The betrayal felt personal, a dagger aimed at the heart of their fragile connection. Anya's silence stretched, a painful testament to the depth of her uncertainty, her eyes searching his for any trace of deception. The faint scent of jasmine struggled against the rising tide of fear and suspicion, a testament to the vulnerability that lay beneath their outward strength. The polished surface of the table seemed to shimmer, reflecting the flickering uncertainty in their eyes. The fate of their empires and their newfound, fragile bond hung precariously in the balance. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Anya's hands, the polished surface reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights like a fractured mirror. The scent of old paper and expensive coffee hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the jasmine usually perfuming her office. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. Julian watched her, his own anxiety mirrored in the subtle tremor of his hands. He'd expected anger, suspicion. He'd even braced himself for accusations. But this chilling silence was worse. "It wasn't just a leak, Anya," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. He reached for a water glass, his fingers brushing against the cool condensation, a small comfort in the overwhelming tension. It was targeted. Someone knew exactly what information to release, when to release it. Someone who knows both our companies intimately. Anya finally met his gaze, her eyes, usually bright and sharp, clouded with a weariness that pierced him. "And who would that be?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the words laced with a pain that mirrored his own. He didn't answer immediately. The thought of a traitor in their inner circles, someone close enough to orchestrate such a precise betrayal, sent a cold wave of fear washing over him. It felt like a violation, a breach of trust that went beyond business. This was about their shared vulnerability, their carefully constructed bridge of trust swaying precariously. "We need to talk to Marcus," Anya said, breaking the silence. Marcus, Julian's longtime CFO, had always seemed unflappable, an island of calm amidst the swirling chaos of their respective enterprises. The thought of his potential involvement left a bitter taste in Julian's mouth. Or maybe, Sarah? Julian countered, his voice strained. Sarah was Anya's head of marketing, equally capable and fiercely loyal, or so he'd thought. The possibility of betrayal from those closest to them was like a slow poison, corroding their alliance. Anya's jaw tightened. This isn't just about protecting our businesses anymore, is it? She said, her voice low and dangerous. The scent of jasmine finally returned, faint but persistent, a ghostly echo of the trust they'd built, now shrouded in doubt. The weight of their shared history, the fragility of their bond, hung heavy in the air, each silent moment a threat to the fragile alliance they were desperately trying to hold together. The faint ticking of the clock became more prominent, each second a hammer blow to the already fragile peace. The air in Anya's office crackled with unspoken accusations. Sunlight, fractured by the cityscape beyond the panoramic window, cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the silent air. The scent of expensive leather and polished wood did little to mask the underlying tension, a palpable force that vibrated between Anya and Julian. Marcus, Sarah, Julian repeated, his voice rough. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the gesture betraying the turmoil within. He felt the familiar cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach, a chilling echo of the betrayal that had ripped through their fragile truce. Anya's gaze was unwavering, her eyes dark pools reflecting the shadows of her own suspicion. The usually vibrant energy that thrummed around her was absent, replaced by a chilling stillness. Or maybe, she said, her voice low and measured, it was someone we both trusted implicitly, someone who knew our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities, someone who knew about our past. The unspoken accusation hung between them, heavy and suffocating. The shared trauma, the carefully buried secrets of their childhood, rose to the surface, poisoning the air with a bitter tang of regret and betrayal. Julian felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He had always guarded his privileged past, but Anya's words stripped bare his carefully constructed defenses. He looked at her, truly saw her, the pain etched into her face a mirror of his own. The chasm of their vastly different upbringings seemed to widen, the differences emphasized by their shared pain. He saw a reflection of his own privileged ignorance in the hurt in her eyes, the depth of the betrayal cutting deeper than any business scandal. This was about something far more fundamental, something that ran deeper than any corporate conspiracy. This was about their fractured family, their shared pain, and the haunting legacy of a past they had both tried so hard to escape. The silence stretched, heavy and unforgiving, the ticking clock a relentless reminder of the time slipping away, the trust eroding with each passing second. The mahogany desk between them felt like a battlefield, cold and unforgiving. Julian ran a hand over the smooth surface, the polished wood a stark contrast to the roughness of his own emotions. Anya's silence was heavier than any shouted accusation. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, mirroring the storm raging inside him. It wasn't Marcus, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. The words felt inadequate, pale against the weight of his guilt. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Anya's suspicion, though aimed at his longtime associate, was justified. The betrayal ran deeper than one person. Anya finally looked up. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and fire, were clouded with pain. The sharp lines of her face seemed etched deeper, a testament to the sleepless nights spent wrestling with doubt and betrayal. Then who, Julian? Who would risk everything, knowing the impact it would have on us? Her voice was barely a whisper, laced with a fatigue that went beyond mere exhaustion. He swallowed, the lump in his throat a physical manifestation of his own self-recrimination. The truth was a bitter pill, difficult to swallow, and even more difficult to confess. It was a conspiracy, he began, his words halting, unsure. Multiple people acting in concert. They targeted us both, playing on our shared past, our vulnerabilities. He paused, watching her carefully, searching for any glimmer of understanding, any sign that she could begin to comprehend the web of deceit that had ensnared them both. The rain intensified, a relentless drumming against the glass. He felt a familiar chill, a memory of a similar storm years ago, a shared childhood memory that resurfaced, sharp and painful. The betrayal wasn't just about business. It reached back into their shared history, poisoning their fragile connection with its venom. Anya's gaze shifted, settling on a framed photo on her desk. A picture of them as children, two smiling faces, their connection clear even then. The image shattered the tension, briefly replaced by shared grief. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding of a past pain, a wound that had reopened, cruelly exposed. The fight for their business empire now felt trivial against the backdrop of their shared trauma. The road to reconciliation, he knew, would be long and arduous, but the shared pain, the shared history, was a starting point, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their different worlds. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust of years, but the scars of their past and the wounds of the present remained. The air in Anya's office crackled with unspoken accusations. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows, mirroring the tempest brewing between them. Julian, usually so composed, felt raw, exposed. He watched Anya, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond exhaustion, a profound sadness settling in her usually bright eyes. The mahogany desk, a symbol of their shared success and bitter rivalry, felt like a chasm separating them. "It wasn't Marcus," he repeated, his voice rough. The words hung heavy in the air, insufficient to bridge the gulf between them. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a tiny spark of hope amidst the ashes of betrayal. Anya finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Then who, Julian? Who would risk everything to hurt us both?" The question hung in the air, a silent indictment. The scent of rain, sharp and clean, mingled with the faint aroma of expensive coffee, a jarring juxtaposition of nature's brutality and manufactured comfort. He hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "A network," he confessed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "They manipulated us, played on our vulnerabilities, our shared past. It was a calculated attack, designed to fracture our alliance." The confession felt inadequate, a pale substitute for the complex web of deceit he'd only just begun to unravel. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Anya ran a hand through her hair, the gesture revealing a vulnerability Julian hadn't seen before. The shared trauma, the years of separation, the sudden, explosive revelation of their connection. It all seemed to coalesce into a crushing weight, threatening to overwhelm them both. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her eyes, a shared burden of betrayal and confusion. The rain continued its relentless assault, washing away the superficial sheen of their lives, leaving only the raw, exposed truth of their predicament. The battle for their business empires suddenly felt insignificant compared to the fight to salvage their newfound, fragile relationship. The journey ahead, he knew, would be fraught with challenges, but at least they now faced them together. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid Miami night pressing against the glass walls of Julian's penthouse. He stared out at the glittering cityscape, the vibrant lights a stark contrast to the darkness swirling within him. Anya's words echoed in his ears. "Then who, Julian? Who would risk everything to hurt us both?" A question that clawed at his conscience. He poured himself another whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to soothe the burning in his throat. The ice clinked softly, a fragile sound in the vast, opulent space. He thought of his meticulously crafted life, the empire he'd built brick by painstaking brick, now crumbling under the weight of a betrayal so profound it shattered his sense of security. His carefully cultivated composure, the mask he wore to the world, had finally cracked. The phone vibrated on the polished mahogany table, the jarring sound pulling him from his self-imposed exile. He hesitated, the simple act of answering a call feeling monumental. He looked at the name flashing on the screen, his lawyer, Samuel. The name itself felt like an indictment, a a symbol of the legal battles that lay ahead, battles that seemed trivial compared to the emotional wreckage he was struggling to navigate. He took a deep breath, steeling himself. "Samuel," he answered, his voice betraying a tremor he couldn't control. "I need to know everything, every detail about this network. Spare me nothing." The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, a relentless reminder of time's relentless march forward. He listened intently, the lawyer's clipped tones painting a picture of insidious manipulation, of calculated betrayals, and of a conspiracy far larger than he could have imagined. Each word chipped away at his carefully constructed world, exposing the vulnerabilities he'd spent a lifetime concealing. He felt the familiar sting of tears, a physical manifestation of the emotional turmoil tearing him apart. His carefully constructed world was falling apart, and with it, his sense of self. He slumped back in his chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. He needed Anya. He needed her strength, her resilience, her unwavering spirit to help him navigate this storm. But could he even face her? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the rain outside intensified, mirroring the tempest raging within him. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Anya's hands, the polished surface reflecting the storm raging outside. Rain lashed against the windows of her office, mirroring the turmoil in her heart. Julian's call, a clipped apology followed by a plea for a meeting, had left her breathless. Trust, she'd learned, was a fragile thing easily shattered, especially when built on the foundation of a betrayal so profound. "He sounds different," her head of security, Marcus, said, his voice low. He stood by the window, his silhouette a stark outline against the gray sky. "More vulnerable." Anya sighed, the sound lost in the drumming rain. "Vulnerable? Julian Thorne? That's a new one." The bitter irony tasted like ash in her mouth. She rubbed her temples, the throbbing a dull ache behind her eyes. The betrayal hadn't just shaken her business. It had shaken her faith in the possibility of a genuine connection with her twin. "He wants to meet at the old carousel," Marcus continued, his voice hesitant. "The one by the lake where, you know?" The mention of the carousel, a shared memory, a painful reminder of their stolen childhood, sent a shiver down Anya's spine. The rusted metal, the chipped paint, the faint scent of decaying wood. It was all too vivid. The image of their younger selves, separated by circumstances beyond their control, brought a fresh wave of sadness. Anya ran a hand through her hair, her reflection a blurry image in the rain-streaked glass. "Fine," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "But Marcus, you're coming with me." The meeting at the old carousel was as fraught as she expected. The air was thick with unspoken accusations and years of hurt. Julian, stripped of his usual polished exterior, looked lost, his eyes haunted. The silence between them was broken only by the creak of the carousel's rusted frame and the relentless drumming of the rain. The carousel's paint-chipped horses were a somber testament to the broken childhood they shared. "I need your help, Anya," Julian finally said, his voice hoarse. This goes beyond business. It's about us." His gaze was desperate, stripped of its usual arrogance. Anya hesitated. Could she trust him? Could she forgive him? The weight of years of resentment threatened to overwhelm her, but beneath it, a flicker of that long-dormant bond, the shared DNA, whispered of a different possibility. The storm raged on, but within Anya, a fragile hope, as delicate as a butterfly's wing, began to unfurl. The carousel groaned, a rusty sigh in the relentless wind. Rain slicked the chipped paint of the horses, mirroring the sheen of unshed tears on Julian's face. He looked smaller, somehow, stripped of the tailored suits and confident swagger Anya had come to associate with him. This Julian was raw, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the polished facade he usually presented. "I messed up," he said, his voice a low rumble, swallowed by the storm's roar. He didn't meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on the decaying wood of the carousel's frame. The scent of wet wood and damp earth hung heavy in the air, a poignant reminder of their shared past. Anya shifted, the damp cold seeping through her coat. Marcus stood silently behind her, a watchful guardian against the gray sky. She'd brought him not just for protection, but as a silent witness to Julian's desperate plea. His vulnerability was unsettling, almost offensive after the callous betrayal. "Messed up is an understatement, Julian," she replied, her voice tight with unshed anger. "You destroyed years of work, years of fighting, all for what?" He looked up then, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. The years of separation, the stark differences in their lives, the crushing weight of their shared past. It was all etched into the lines around his eyes, the slump of his shoulders. "For a chance to fix things," he whispered, his voice cracking. "To be family. I know it's a pathetic excuse, but it's true." He gestured around them, the dilapidated carousel a metaphor for their shattered lives. This is where it all went wrong, isn't it? This is where we lost each other." The wind howled, a mournful cry echoing the emptiness in Anya's heart. The rain, a relentless barrage, seemed to pound against her own defenses, chipping away at the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her grief and anger. She saw a flicker of the boy she'd glimpsed in fleeting memories, lost and afraid, beneath the polished veneer of the millionaire. Anya hesitated. The betrayal was immense, the hurt still raw. But in the desolate landscape of the old carousel, under the mournful cry of the wind, a sliver of something else emerged. A fragile hope, a faint echo of the sister she'd never known, the family she'd always longed for. The storm raged, but in the silence between them, a different kind of storm was brewing. A storm of reconciliation. The rusted gates of the orphanage creaked open, a mournful groan mirroring the weight in Anya's heart. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a stark contrast to the sterile, antiseptic smell of Julian's childhood home. He trailed behind her, his usual confident stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. The overgrown ground swallowed them, the silence broken only by the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. "It's different," Julian murmured, his voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of ancient oaks. He looked around, his eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and unease. The place felt suffocating, a stark reminder of a past he'd actively erased from his memory. Anya nodded, her gaze fixed on a crumbling stone statue of a cherubic angel, its wings broken, its face eroded by time. "Different," she echoed, the word a bitter taste on her tongue. "But familiar. This is where the echoes live." They walked in silence for a while, the path overgrown and barely discernible. The dilapidated buildings loomed before them, their paint peeling, windows dark and vacant. The memories, long suppressed, began to surface. The echo of laughter, the sting of loneliness, the bitter taste of abandonment. A shared childhood, fractured and distorted by a system that had cruelly separated them. Julian stopped abruptly, his face pale. "I remember this swing set," he whispered, pointing to a rusted frame half hidden by weeds. I used to spend hours here." Anya walked towards it, running a hand along the cold, metallic bars. A wave of nausea washed over her. The swing set, the only remnant of a carefree childhood, felt tainted, poisoned by the bitter knowledge of what followed. "So did I," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "We used to play together, didn't we?" He nodded, tears welling in his eyes. The polished veneer of the millionaire had vanished, replaced by a raw, vulnerable man confronting the ghosts of his past. The shared memories, the fragments of a forgotten bond, began to weave a thread of understanding between them. This was the beginning of their journey of healing, a journey paved with sorrow but leading towards reconciliation. The air thrummed with unspoken words, unspoken forgiveness. The storm of their betrayal had passed. Now, a gentle rain of understanding began to fall. The orphanage's crumbling stone steps felt cold beneath Anya's bare feet. The chill seeped into her bones, a physical manifestation of the emotional ice that had formed between her and Julian. The shared memories of the previous day, the fragile threads of connection, seemed to snap under the weight of their unspoken accusations. The air hung heavy with the unspoken. Julian stood beside her, his expensive suit a jarring contrast to the decay surrounding them. He looked lost, the usual arrogance stripped away, revealing a vulnerability Anya hadn't anticipated. The weight of his privilege, the realization of his complicity in her pain, seemed to bear down on him. I didn't know," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. The words hung in the air, inadequate, yet heavy with a sincere attempt at contrition. Anya didn't respond immediately. She stared at the broken angel statue, its chipped wings mirroring the shattered remnants of her hopes. The years of loneliness, the bitterness of a childhood stolen, welled up in her throat. The silence stretched, a tangible entity between them. "Knowing isn't enough," she finally said, her voice low and husky. She picked up a smooth, gray stone, turning it over and over in her hand. "Knowing doesn't change the fact that you had everything, and I had nothing. Knowing doesn't erase the years of struggle, the constant fight for survival." He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. The touch, when it finally came, was gentle, hesitant. A silent apology, a tentative bridge across the chasm between them. "I understand," he murmured, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to understand." The strained faces gathered around the table. Anya's usually sharp gaze was clouded with fatigue, her usual composed demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. Julian, beside her, felt the familiar prickle of anxiety. The air hung thick with the unspoken threat of a looming lawsuit from Omnicorp, a rival company hungry to exploit the fragility of their newly merged enterprise. The scent of expensive leather and old wood did little to soothe the tension. "They're playing dirty, Julian," Anya said, her voice low but firm, breaking the silence. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The flickering fluorescent lights seemed to emphasize the shadows under her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights spent strategizing. Julian nodded grimly, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the table. "We knew this was coming. Their desperation is palpable." He leaned forward, his gaze meeting hers. He saw the familiar flicker of fear, hidden beneath a wall of defiance. He knew that fear. He'd felt it himself countless times throughout the tumultuous merger. But this time, the fear wasn't just about business. It was about her, about their shared, fragile future. "It's more than just business, Anya," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. The warmth of his touch seemed to momentarily pierce the chill in the room. Anya looked at his hand, then at his face, her expression unreadable. He continued, his voice gaining strength. "They're trying to break us. They're trying to break us." He squeezed her hand gently, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. She didn't pull away. This wasn't a business meeting. It was a silent pact, a recognition of the deep, unforeseen bond forged between them. A bond that transcended competition and extended into the very core of their shared being. The combined weight of their rival empires, their shared trauma, and their budding sisterhood pressed down on them, a challenge only they could conquer together. The fight had only just begun. The scent of stale coffee and impending doom hung heavy in Anya's office, a stark contrast to the sleek, modern design. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm brewing inside her. Julian, perched on the edge of a sleek, minimalist chair, watched her pace. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of her heels against the polished floor was a counterpoint to the frantic drumming of his own heart. "They're not just after the merger, Anya," Julian said, his voice low, a tremor betraying his carefully constructed composure. He hadn't slept properly in days. The weight of their shared responsibility, their intertwined destinies, pressed down on him with suffocating force. Anya stopped pacing, her back ramrod straight. The harsh lines of her face, usually softened by a warm smile, were etched with worry. Then what are they after? She asked, her voice tight with suppressed anger. Julian hesitated. They're after us, he finally said, the words hanging heavy in the air. They know about everything. He watched her face, searching for a reaction, a flicker of understanding. The fear he saw mirrored his own. The rain intensified, the wind howling like a mournful banshee. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked glass, a chaotic reflection of the turmoil within. Anya's eyes, usually bright and full of life, were clouded with a deep, unsettling weariness. She ran a hand through her already disheveled hair, a gesture of frustration and exhaustion. They're digging, she whispered, the words barely audible above the storm. Digging into our past, into our parents. The unspoken accusation hung between them, a chilling reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The shared trauma, the carefully buried secrets, now threatened to engulf them. Julian nodded grimly. The threat wasn't just to their business empire. It was a direct assault on their fragile, newly found family. The weight of this realization was almost unbearable. He rose, crossing the short distance to stand before her. We faced this together, Anya, he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was a silent affirmation, a promise of unwavering support in the face of overwhelming odds. The storm raged outside, but inside, a flicker of shared resolve burned brightly. Their fight had only just begun. The mahogany boardroom, usually a stage for calculated power plays, felt suffocatingly small. Anya and Julian sat across from each other, the polished table a chasm between them. The air, thick with the scent of expensive leather and unspoken anxieties, crackled with tension. Outside, the city lights blurred into a shimmering, indifferent tapestry. Their investigation is relentless, Anya said, her voice low, a tremor betraying the carefully constructed composure she maintained. She picked at a loose thread on her impeccably tailored suit, a nervous habit Julian had noticed only recently. He saw the familiar flash of fear in her eyes, a mirror of his own. Julian leaned forward, the weight of their shared predicament pressing down. They've unearthed old articles, things about our parents, things that were supposed to stay buried. He felt the familiar knot of guilt tighten in his stomach. The past, so meticulously swept under the rug, was now being dragged into the harsh light of day, threatening to expose the fault lines beneath their seemingly perfect lives. Anya's gaze hardened. They're trying to use our past against us, to break us. Her voice, usually so strong, carried a note of vulnerability. The rain outside intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. Julian watched the reflection of the storm in her eyes, the fear, the exhaustion, the unwavering resolve. He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. The briefest touch, a silent acknowledgement of their shared burden, their shared vulnerability. He felt the warmth of her skin through the fine fabric of her glove. We won't let them win, he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. The words were a promise, a vow forged in the crucible of their shared fear. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with the unspoken understanding of their precarious position. The future of their empire, their lives, their fragile, newfound relationship hung in the balance. The storm raged on outside, a fitting backdrop to the tempest brewing within their hearts. Their fight, they both knew, was far from over. The rain hammered against the panoramic windows of Anya's penthouse apartment, mirroring the tempest brewing inside her. The city lights, usually a dazzling spectacle, were muted, blurred by the downpour. Julian, perched on the edge of a plush velvet sofa, watched her pace. The scent of rain and expensive sandalwood candles filled the air, a stark contrast to the tension crackling between them. It's not just the business, Anya finally said, her voice tight. She stopped pacing, her back to him, the silhouette of her sharply tailored shoulders tense. The expensive silk of her blouse rustled softly. It's everything. The past, the lies, everything feels like it's unraveling. Julian rose, crossing the room to stand beside her. He could feel the tremor in her body, the barely contained frustration radiating from her. He placed a hand gently on her arm. The contact was brief, respectful, but it conveyed a silent reassurance. He could see the exhaustion etched onto her face, the dark circles under her eyes. The Anya he knew, the fiercely independent businesswoman, seemed to have been replaced by a fragile, vulnerable woman. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with empathy. "And I'm sorry. For everything. For the privilege, for the ignorance, for the years we lost." His voice caught. He couldn't fully express the weight of his guilt, the regret that gnawed at him. Anya turned. Her eyes, usually sparkling with intelligence and fire, were filled with unshed tears. The anger that had been her shield was dissolving, leaving behind a raw vulnerability. She leaned into his touch, the slightest movement, a subtle acknowledgement of his support. "It's not just about the past, Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the relentless drumming of the rain. "It's about the future, about what we do now, about whether we can build something real, something strong together." He pulled her close, a silent promise in his embrace. The rain continued its furious assault, but within the confines of her apartment, a fragile peace settled. The fight for their business, their lives, their future, was far from over, but for the first time, they faced it together, side by side. A shaky alliance forged in the crucible of shared trauma and a burgeoning, fragile hope. The mahogany boardroom, usually a stage for Julian's confident pronouncements, felt oppressive. Anya sat opposite him, the polished table a stark divide between them. The scent of expensive coffee hung heavy in the air, a bitter aroma mirroring the mood. Julian traced a finger along the grain of the wood, his gaze fixed on the swirling patterns. "The shareholders are restless," he said, his voice low. The words hung between them, unspoken anxieties clinging to the silence that followed. Anya leaned back, her posture betraying none of the turmoil she felt. The city sprawled outside the panoramic windows, a glittering tapestry of lights oblivious to their internal struggle. "Restless or terrified?" she countered, her voice sharp. "This merger, it's a gamble, Julian. A huge one." He met her gaze, his own eyes reflecting the city lights, a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "It's the only way," he replied, his voice stronger now, "to build something lasting, something better than the separate entities we inherited." He hesitated, the unspoken weight of their shared past heavy in the air, the memory of their estranged parents, the pain of their fragmented childhood, loomed over them like a silent specter. Anya nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. The tension in the room tightened, a palpable force pressing down on them. The city outside seemed to hold its breath, mirroring their own internal struggle. "Better?" she repeated, a soft whisper. "Or different? We're building this on fractured foundations, Julian. Can we truly expect it to stand?" He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers. The gesture was hesitant, fraught with the unspoken fears and insecurities that had haunted them both. He withdrew his hand, the silence stretching again. The weight of their shared burden, the responsibility of their combined empires, felt almost unbearable. The faint hum of the city, usually a comfort, now seemed to mock their fragile peace. The future of their company, and perhaps their relationship, hung precariously in the balance. The weight of their shared past pressed down on them like a physical burden. Anya stared out at the cityscape, the glittering towers reflecting the turmoil in her heart. The merger wasn't just about business. It was about rebuilding a shattered past, a shared history fractured by circumstances beyond their control. Julian watched her, his own anxieties mirrored in the faint lines etched around his eyes, lines that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. "It's not just the shareholders, Anya," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence that had stretched taut between them. "It's us. We're putting everything on the line." Anya turned, her gaze meeting his. The city lights glinted in her eyes, a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Everything?" she echoed, a hint of bitterness coloring her tone. Because for me, Julian, this isn't just about building an empire. It's about proving something to myself, to them. She gestured vaguely towards the panoramic view. The city, a symbol of the life she'd fought so hard to build. A life that was now inextricably linked to his. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew the weight of her words, the years of struggle, the ingrained suspicion she carried, the constant battle against a world that had never truly accepted her. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want to help you carry that burden. Not just as a business partner, but as a sister." The word hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, a testament to the journey they'd undertaken. The mahogany table no longer seemed to represent a divide, but a shared space, a battlefield transformed into a fragile truce. A single tear traced a path down Anya's cheek, reflecting the city lights like a tiny, shimmering star. He reached across the table, his hand gently covering hers. This time, his touch was not hesitant, but filled with a gentle understanding born of shared pain and a nascent hope for a future built not on fractured foundations, but on the solid ground of a newly formed sisterhood. The city outside continued its vibrant hum, but now it felt like a supportive rhythm, a soundtrack to their newfound strength. The gamble remained, but in that moment, hand in hand, across the polished mahogany, they faced it together. The mahogany boardroom felt colder now, the celebratory champagne flutes replaced by the stark silence of impending crisis. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows, mirroring the storm brewing inside Anya. Julian, usually impeccably composed, fidgeted with a pen, the expensive metal cool against his sweating palm. The financial reports lay scattered, a testament to their mounting losses. "It's worse than we thought," Julian finally admitted, his voice a low murmur barely audible above the drumming rain. He looked up, meeting Anya's gaze, but found no solace in her usually unwavering strength. Her face, etched with exhaustion and worry, was pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. "I know," Anya replied, her voice tight with suppressed anger. The city lights, usually a source of inspiration, now felt like cold, indifferent witnesses to their unraveling. The sabotage, it wasn't random. Someone orchestrated this. The accusation hung heavy in the air, unspoken but understood. Suspicion, a poisonous weed, was already taking root. A wave of nausea washed over Julian. He'd built his empire on meticulous planning, on calculated risk. But this felt different. This was personal. A betrayal that struck at the very heart of their fragile alliance, threatening not just their business, but the tentative bond they were painstakingly building. "We need to find out who," he said, his voice firmer now, a resolve hardening within him. He stood, pushing back his chair, the harsh scrape of metal a jarring sound in the oppressive silence. He walked to the window, the cold glass a stark contrast to the burning anxiety in his chest. The rain continued its relentless assault, each drop a tiny hammer against the glass, mirroring the relentless pressure bearing down on them. Anya followed him, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. She placed a hand on his arm, a gesture both comforting and bracing. It was a shared burden, after all, a shared fight. "Together," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The rain softened slightly, a brief respite in the storm. The city lights, momentarily obscured by the clouds, flickered back to life, offering a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they were truly facing it together, as sisters, as partners, as equals. The shared weight, though heavy, was now shared. The scent of stale coffee and fear hung heavy in the air. Anya stared at the security footage, the grainy images showing a familiar face slipping a data drive into a server room. Marcus, Julian's supposedly loyal head of IT. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. It felt like a violation of the fragile trust they'd painstakingly built. Julian entered, the quiet click of his expensive loafers echoing the hollow ache in Anya's chest. He didn't need words. The slump of his shoulders, The exhaustion etched onto his usually flawless face spoke volumes. He poured himself a coffee, the dark liquid sloshing in the mug a stark contrast to the pale tremor in his hand. He was so meticulous, Anya whispered, her voice raw. He had access to everything. Julian's gaze dropped to the footage, his reflection shimmering faintly in the screen. The man staring back was a stranger, haunted, weary, far removed from the polished millionaire she'd initially known. "He was close to both of us," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I trusted him implicitly." The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the office computers. Anya felt a wave of nausea, the betrayal a bitter taste in her mouth. This wasn't just about money. It was about the shattering of their fragile alliance, the erosion of the tentative hope that had begun to blossom. Anya reached for Julian's arm, her fingers finding his, a silent gesture of shared pain. The coldness of his skin was alarming. "We have to face this together," she said, her voice firm, a fierce determination strengthening her. "We can't let this destroy us." Julian nodded, a single, decisive movement. The shared gaze between them, heavy with unspoken emotions, was a silent promise. They would face the storm together, as sisters, as partners, their bond tested but not broken. The fight for their company and their newfound family had just begun, and this time they would fight smarter, stronger, together. The rain outside intensified, mirroring the growing storm within, but within that storm, a new resolve ignited the determination to rebuild, to trust, to forgive, and to truly become a family. The mahogany boardroom felt colder than usual, the polished surface reflecting the grim expressions around the table. Dust motes danced in the harsh fluorescent light, illuminating the tension simmering between Anya and Julian's warring teams. The air thrummed with unspoken accusations, the scent of expensive cologne battling the sharp tang of Anya's anxiety. "We need a new strategy," Julian stated, his voice tight, betraying the carefully constructed facade of calm. His fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the table, the sound amplified in the tense silence. He looked at Anya, his gaze searching hers for a sign of agreement, of shared purpose. Anya leaned forward, her dark eyes intense. "And what, exactly, is your new strategy, Julian?" The steel in her voice echoed the hardness of her gaze. Years of battling to earn her place in a world that had initially tried to ignore her had not been for nothing. She wasn't afraid to fight. "We consolidate," Julian replied, his jaw clenched. "We cut the losses in the marketing division, reallocate resources. It's painful but necessary." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of difficult decisions. The silence that followed was thick, pregnant with the unspoken fear of failure. A low murmur rippled through the room. Anya's team exchanged anxious glances, their apprehension palpable. Julian's team, though outwardly reserved, were subtly shifting in their seats, a subtle display of nervousness. "Cutting marketing means losing momentum," Anya countered, her voice edged with controlled fury. "It's a gamble we can't afford." Her gaze swept across the faces of her team, searching their eyes for reassurance. She saw doubt reflected back at her. The worry etched onto their faces was a mirror to her own. Julian sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. The weight of his decision hung heavily on his shoulders. "We have no choice, Anya. We're bleeding money, and Marcus's betrayal has complicated things significantly." He avoided her eyes, the admission of failure a bitter pill to swallow. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with the ghost of the betrayal still haunting them. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about their survival. Anya's gaze softened just a fraction, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They were in this together, bound by a shared trauma, a shared responsibility. The fight wasn't just for their empire. It was for their fragile, newfound sisterhood. The aroma of strong coffee hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent scent of leather and mahogany that usually permeated Julian's office. He stared out the panoramic window, the city lights blurring into a shimmering, indistinct tapestry. The merger, once a symbol of triumphant siblinghood, now felt like a suffocating weight. Anya's absence was a palpable void, the silence in the room amplifying the turmoil within him. He picked up a framed photo, a faded image of himself and Anya as children, their smiles innocent and bright, oblivious to the fractured future that awaited them. The memory stung, a sharp reminder of the shared past he was struggling to reconcile with his present reality. He'd underestimated the depth of the cultural chasm separating their teams, the subtle yet pervasive biases that festered beneath the surface of professional decorum. A soft knock interrupted his reverie. His assistant, Sarah, entered, her expression concerned. "Mr. Thorne, there's been another leak. Confidential merger documents have surfaced online." The words hit him like a physical blow. Panic clawed at his throat. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. The pressure was immense, the weight of expectation almost unbearable. He thought of Anya, her fierce determination, her unwavering resilience. He needed her. He needed her strength, her sharp intellect, her unwavering belief in the possibility of a shared future. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed her number. The ringing tone felt agonizingly slow, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, her voice, usually crisp and commanding, was hesitant, strained. "Julian, Anya, we have a problem. A big one." He could hear the apprehension in his own voice, the desperation he'd tried so hard to mask. "They've leaked the documents. We need to talk." A long, heavy silence filled the line, punctuated only by the sound of Anya's ragged breathing. Then, a single word, laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. "Okay." The line went dead, leaving Julian alone with the crushing weight of his responsibilities and the chilling uncertainty of what lay ahead. The city lights outside seemed to dim, mirroring the bleakness settling in his heart. The merger, his dream of unity, hung precariously in the balance. The air in Anya's minimalist office hummed with the low thrum of anxious energy. Sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The scent of jasmine from a nearby potted plant battled with the sharp tang of fear clinging to the air. Anya paced, the polished concrete floor cool beneath her bare feet. Julian's call had thrown her world into disarray. The leak, it was catastrophic. "This could unravel everything," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture of familiar comfort in moments of stress. Her assistant, Marcus, watched her with concern. He was loyal, fiercely protective, and he saw the tremor in her usually unwavering composure. "We'll handle this, Ms. Diallo," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "We'll find out who did this and fix it." Anya stopped pacing, her gaze settling on Marcus's calm face. His unwavering support was a lifeline in this storm. She forced a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Marcus. I need that." The admission was raw, vulnerable, a crack in her usually impenetrable armor. The phone buzzed, breaking the tense silence. It was Julian. She hesitated, the familiar knot of distrust warring with a desperate need for his help. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. "Anya," Julian's voice was strained, tight with anxiety. "Did you see the news?" "Yes," she said, her voice low, steady. The practiced calm was a mask, concealing the turmoil within. "I'm already working on damage control." I'm sorry," Julian said, the words halting and hesitant. He sounded vulnerable, stripped of his usual arrogance. Anya felt a flicker of something akin to empathy. "We need to work together, Julian," she said, her voice firm. The shared crisis, the looming threat of failure, forced a grudging truce, a recognition of their interdependence. "This isn't just about the company anymore. It's about us." A beat of silence hung between them, charged with the unspoken weight of their complicated history, the fragile bond forged in the crucible of betrayal and shared trauma. Then, Anya said, "Meet me at the old warehouse. We need to talk." The words hung in the air, a promise of collaboration, a step towards healing, a testament to the enduring power of family, even one forged in the most improbable of circumstances. The warehouse, a place steeped in their shared past, suddenly felt like a more appropriate battleground than the sterile confines of their respective offices. The old warehouse smelled of dust and decay, a stark contrast to the polished steel and glass of Anya and Julian's modern offices. Moonlight sliced through cracks in the corrugated iron roof, painting the cavernous space in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Anya stood by a crumbling loading dock, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the stifling tension inside her. She hugged herself, the thin jacket doing little to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones, a chill mirroring the unease in her heart. Julian arrived, his expensive suit a jarring incongruity in the dilapidated space. He looked tired, the sharp lines of his face softened by exhaustion, his usual arrogance replaced by a vulnerable uncertainty. He didn't speak, just stood beside her, the silence punctuated only by the distant city sounds. The weight of their shared crisis hung heavy between them, a palpable thing. "They're saying it's sabotage," Anya finally said, her voice low, barely audible above the rustle of the wind. The words felt heavy, each syllable laden with the weight of responsibility and fear. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the crumbling concrete floor. "Internal. Someone we both trusted." He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture mirroring Anya's own earlier habit. The shared action, however unintentional, felt like a small, fragile bridge spanning the chasm between them. "Marcus is devastated," Anya confessed, her voice cracking slightly. "He feels responsible." She looked up at Julian, seeing a flicker of similar pain in his eyes. The shared burden, the understanding of betrayal, forged a connection deeper than mere business partnership. "My team too," Julian admitted, his voice husky. "They're shaken." He paused, then added, softer now, "I am." The shared vulnerability, the raw honesty in their voices, broke through the layers of competition and mistrust. They stood there for a long moment, the silence no longer heavy but filled with a shared grief, a shared responsibility. The warehouse, once a symbol of their fractured past, now felt like a space where healing might begin. The moon, a silent witness, seemed to shed a gentle light on the fragile hope that flickered between them. They had to work together not just to save their empires, but to save themselves. The fight, however, was far from over. The enemy within loomed large, their identities still hidden in the shadows. The dawn broke, painting the city skyline in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange. Inside their temporary crisis headquarters, a sterile, windowless conference room, Anya and Julian worked, the hum of computers a low thrum against the silence of their exhaustion. Coffee cups littered the table, testament to a sleepless night. Anya, her usual sharp edges softened by fatigue, massaged her temples. Julian, his expensive suit rumpled, stared blankly at a screen filled with complex financial data. "They're suggesting a complete restructuring," Julian finally said, his voice hoarse. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their predicament. Anya sighed, pushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "And that means layoffs?" The question hung in the air, unspoken accusations of betrayal and failure. Julian nodded, avoiding her gaze. "It's the only way to salvage what's left. We need to be lean, efficient, ruthless." The word hung in the air, a bitter taste. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the pain mirrored in her own, a reflection of his own internal turmoil. The idea of letting people go, of impacting innocent lives, horrified him. It was a far cry from the ruthless decisions he once took for granted. "Ruthless is what almost destroyed us," Anya countered softly, her voice laced with a quiet steel. She leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. "This time we do it differently. We find a way to weather this storm without sacrificing everything we've built, without sacrificing our people." Her voice, though quiet, held a newfound strength, a resilience forged in the fires of adversity. It was a strength he recognized as his own, buried under layers of privilege and self-doubt. Julian watched her, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about saving a company. It was about saving their shared vision, their shared future, their shared humanity. He saw past the rivalry, past the differences, to the core of their shared essence. The crisis, instead of tearing them apart, was forging a stronger, more resilient bond. "We find another way," Julian agreed, a faint smile playing on his lips. The weariness was still there, but it was tempered with a sense of shared purpose, of hope. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, they were truly facing it, together. The dawn, once a symbol of impending doom, now felt like a promise of a new beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in the boardroom, a stark contrast to the vibrant energy that usually pulsed through Anya's office. Sunlight, filtered through the high-rise windows, cast long shadows across the mahogany table where Anya and Julian sat, reviewing the restructuring proposal. The air hung heavy with unspoken anxieties. Julian nervously tapped a pen against the polished surface, the rhythmic click echoing in the otherwise silent room. This feels wrong," Anya finally said, her voice low, a tremor running through it. She pushed the document away, the crisp paper crinkling under her touch. The proposal, laid out in neat, clinical terms, felt like a death sentence. Julian met her gaze, his own eyes shadowed with doubt. He'd spent his life making calculated, ruthless decisions, but this felt different. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about people's lives, people's futures. He saw the reflection of his own inner turmoil in Anya's worried expression. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of his privilege, the years spent operating from a position of invulnerability, pressed down on him. He'd never truly considered the human cost of his decisions before. He'd seen people as pawns, but Anya had shown him their faces. Anya reached across the table, her hand gently covering his. The unexpected contact sent a jolt through him. It wasn't just a business partnership anymore. It was something deeper, something forged in the crucible of shared trauma and newfound understanding. "We'll find another way," she insisted, her grip firm, her voice filled with a quiet determination that both surprised and reassured him. "We built this together. We won't let it crumble now." Julian nodded, a small, shaky movement. He felt a surge of hope, fragile yet powerful, ignite within him. The dawn of a new day was approaching, and this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about rebuilding not just their companies but themselves together. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to face it, side by side with his sister. The scent of antiseptic faded slightly, replaced by a faint but undeniable scent of possibility. The merger, initially a symbol of unity, had fractured into 1,000 tiny fissures. The air in the newly renovated break room, designed to foster collaboration, hummed with unspoken tension. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, usually a comforting scent, felt sharp and bitter against Anya's palate. She watched Julian, hunched over a spreadsheet, his usually sharp features softened by fatigue. Dark circles underscored his eyes, mirroring her own exhaustion. "It's not working, is it?" Anya asked, her voice barely a whisper against the low murmur of conversation. Julian looked up, his gaze meeting hers with a weariness that tugged at her heart. He sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of responsibility. "The cultural clash. It's deeper than we anticipated. My team, they still see you as the enemy." Anya nodded, a familiar ache settling in her chest. "And yours, they don't trust me. They think I'm just using this merger to gain an advantage." She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture betraying her frustration. The sleek lines of the modern furniture, meant to inspire innovation, felt cold and unyielding. "We need to address this head-on," Julian said, his voice regaining some of its usual firmness. "We can't let this resentment undermine everything we've built." He rose, his chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the otherwise quiet space. He walked to the window, the city sprawling beneath them, a glittering tapestry of lights and shadows. But how? Anya asked, her voice laced with doubt. The city lights seemed to reflect her own uncertainty. How do we bridge this chasm? Years of competition, ingrained prejudices. It's not something you can just erase overnight. Julian turned, his expression resolute. The city lights illuminated the determination in his eyes. We start by acknowledging it, he said, his voice low but firm. We admit our failures, our shortcomings. We show them, not just tell them, that we're in this together, for real this time. For both of us, this is about more than just business. It's about family. It's about building a future where neither of us has to constantly look over our shoulder. He reached out, his hand covering hers. This time, there was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just a shared understanding of the immense task ahead and the even greater strength that their bond could provide. The bitter coffee suddenly tasted a little sweeter. The fight was far from over, but this time, they wouldn't face it alone. The air in the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee meeting crackled with a nervous energy. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the modern conference room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Anya, perched at the head of the mahogany table, felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Julian sat beside her, his usual confident posture slightly less rigid, a hint of vulnerability in his usually composed demeanor. So, Anya began, her voice calm despite the tremor in her hands. We've identified some key areas needing immediate attention. The unconscious bias training. It's a good start, but it feels superficial to some. A young, black woman, Chloe, spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. It felt like a checkbox exercise, honestly. It didn't address the systemic issues we still face. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken resentment. Julian leaned forward, his gaze meeting Chloe's directly. I understand, he said, his voice sincere, and I apologize. We failed to truly grasp the depth of the problem. This isn't just about ticking boxes. It's about building a genuinely inclusive culture. The honesty in his tone surprised Anya. He seemed genuinely remorseful, not just performing a corporate apology. The meeting progressed, a slow, painstaking process of acknowledgement and compromise. Julian listened intently, absorbing the criticisms and suggestions, his body language softening with each contribution. He actively engaged with employees from both companies, his participation a stark contrast to the initial resistance Anya had faced. Later, alone in Anya's office, Julian poured 2 glasses of wine. The sunset painted the city in hues of orange and purple. I've never really seen this city like this before, Julian mused, gesturing towards the panoramic view. Always been too focused on the bottom line. Anya smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. It's beautiful, isn't it? And there's so much more to life than just the bottom line. He clinked his glass against hers. To second chances, he said, his voice filled with a newfound hope that mirrored the city's vibrant sunset. And to building something truly better. The weight of their shared past, the friction of their merger, and the challenges yet to overcome still lingered, but for the first time, it felt manageable. The foundation of trust, carefully constructed amidst the ruins of their rivalry, felt remarkably strong. The scent of old books and polished wood hung heavy in the air of Julian's childhood study. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sun, slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the intricate carvings on his grandfather's desk. He sat there, a half-empty glass of scotch warming his hand, the silence broken only by the distant city hum. Anya stood by the fireplace, her gaze fixed on a faded photograph, a younger version of them, 2 children with strikingly similar features, yet worlds apart in their expressions. It's strange, Anya finally murmured, her voice low, almost a whisper, to see us like that. Julian nodded, the movement slow and deliberate. He'd spent weeks poring over old family albums, piecing together a fractured past. The shared history felt both exhilarating and agonizing. We were so close once. Anya turned, her eyes reflecting the firelight. separated by choices we didn't understand. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Choices that stole my childhood, my identity. He rose and crossed the room, his movements hesitant, yet filled with a newfound gentleness. He placed a hand on her arm, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. The touch lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the years of separation, the pain, the profound loss. "I can't undo it, Anya," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can try to understand, to make things right." The unspoken words hung between them, heavy with the weight of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future. The merging of their empires had been a success, but the true merger, the one of their hearts and souls, was still a work in progress. A journey filled with forgiveness, understanding, and the daunting task of building a foundation of trust on the shattered remnants of a broken family. The fire crackled, a comforting sound in the quiet room, a silent witness to their journey of healing. The future remained uncertain, but in this moment, in the shared silence and the warmth of the firelight, a fragile hope began to bloom. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of Anya's fingers on her mahogany desk was the only sound in the otherwise silent office. Late evening sunlight cast long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. The air hung heavy with the scent of expensive leather and old coffee. She hadn't touched the reports stacked before her, her mind far away, lost in the swirling emotions of the past few months. The merger had been a triumph, a testament to their unlikely partnership, but the cost had been high. Julian entered quietly, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He carried 2 steaming mugs, the aroma of chamomile tea filling the air, a subtle counterpoint to the intensity of the room. He placed one on her desk, the warmth radiating through the ceramic. "Tired?" he asked softly, his voice a low rumble that held a hint of concern. Anya looked up, her eyes, usually bright and sharp, were shadowed with fatigue. "More than I'd like to admit," she admitted, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "The board meeting drained me." "I know," Julian said, settling into the chair opposite her. "It was intense." He paused, watching her. "But we did it. We navigated it together." Anya nodded, picking up her mug. The warmth of the tea was a soothing balm on her raw nerves. "It's different, isn't it? Working together, different," he agreed, his gaze lingering on her. "But good. Better than I ever imagined." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Remember that first meeting? The hostility, the suspicion." Anya chuckled, a low sound that held a trace of bittersweetness. "I remember thinking you were the epitome of everything I despised. And I was probably pretty awful," Julian admitted, a self-deprecating grin spreading across his face. "I still cringe thinking about some of the things I said." Anya laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound that chased away some of the lingering shadows. "Me too. But look at us now." She gestured around the office, a small smile playing on her lips. "A shared empire, a shared life." Julian reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. The contact was warm and reassuring, a silent affirmation of their bond. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And we have a long way to go. But I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." The unspoken promise hung in the air, warm and comforting, a testament to their resilience, their love, and their shared future. The tap-tap-tap of her fingers resumed, now a gentle rhythm, a quiet soundtrack to their newfound peace. The penthouse suite overlooked the city, a glittering tapestry of light against the inky blackness. Anya stood by the window, the cool glass a contrast to the warmth radiating from the champagne flute in her hand. The bubbly stung her throat, a sharp counterpoint to the quiet ache in her chest. Julian entered, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He carried a small, leather-bound book. "I found this," he said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the stillness of the room. He handed her the book, its cover worn smooth with age. It was a collection of children's stories, their shared childhood favorites. Anya's fingers traced the embossed title, A wave of bittersweet nostalgia washed over her. "Remember the illustrations?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She opened the book, the crisp pages whispering softly against each other. The familiar drawings, slightly faded with time, brought a flood of memories. The grumpy badger, Mr. Grumbles, Julian chuckled softly. "You always insisted he was misunderstood." Anya smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, chasing away the shadows lingering there. "He was, and you always thought he was just plain mean." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled only with the distant hum of the city and the rustling of the book's pages. They sat together, side by side, reminiscing, sharing stories of their childhood, their separate worlds slowly merging into a single, shared memory. The shared past felt less like a wound and more like a scar, a reminder of their journey, their resilience. Julian's gaze drifted to Anya's face, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights. He saw not just a rival, not just a sister, but a woman who had battled her way to success against overwhelming odds. A woman he respected and loved. He reached out, gently touching her hand, the contact sending a warmth through both of them. "We've come so far," he said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "From adversaries to this." Anya leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey, the unspoken promise of their future. The city lights twinkled, a silent testament to their shared triumph. Their personal battles weren't over, but the healing had begun, a testament to their newfound sisterhood and the strength of their shared bond. The champagne flute sat untouched, the bubbly forgotten, as a newfound peace settled over them. The sprawling family reunion felt less like a celebration and more like a carefully choreographed dance around old wounds. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows of the sprawling estate, illuminating the awkward silences and forced smiles. Anya, dressed in a simple but elegant silk dress, felt the weight of decades of separation pressing down on her. The scent of lilies, Julian's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a poignant reminder of their shared past. "It's unusual," Julian mumbled, his voice barely audible above the polite chatter. He stood beside her, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, mirroring the beads of perspiration on his forehead. The warmth of the room felt suffocating. Anya nodded, her gaze fixed on a distant cousin she barely recognized. "Unusual is an understatement." Her voice was low, laced with a weariness that went beyond the physical exertion of navigating the unfamiliar faces. She felt a familiar sting of resentment towards the parents who had separated them, resentment towards the system that had allowed it to happen. Their aunt, a formidable woman with eyes that held a lifetime of unspoken stories, approached. "You two need to talk," she declared, her voice firm yet laced with an understanding that both Anya and Julian found unnerving. The years of distance had built a wall between them, but their aunt's unwavering gaze seemed to pierce it. "There's a lot to unpack," Julian admitted, his gaze falling to their clasped hands. The casual touch felt momentous, a silent acknowledgement of the shared journey ahead. Anya squeezed his hand gently. "Indeed there is. The weight of their shared history, the pain of their separate paths, the exhilaration of their newfound connection. All of it hung between them, heavy and palpable, in the bright, sun-drenched room. The reunion was merely a beginning, a tentative step towards a future they were only beginning to envision. The scent of lilies, once a symbol of their separation, now felt like the promise of a shared spring. The mahogany table felt cold beneath Anya's fingertips as she traced the intricate carvings, her mind miles away. The air in Julian's study, usually crisp and sterile, now held the lingering scent of old books and brewing coffee, a grounding contrast to the chaotic whirlwind of the past few weeks. Outside, the city lights twinkled, a glittering tapestry against the inky sky. "It's surreal," Julian said, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the quiet. He sat across from her, his usual sharp edges softened, replaced by a weariness that mirrored her own. Anya nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from her mug. "Surreal doesn't begin to cover it." A lifetime of believing I was alone, only to find this. She gestured between them, a hint of bitterness lacing her voice. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a measured beat against the backdrop of unspoken emotions. Julian reached for a small, leather-bound book, its pages filled with faded photographs. He opened it to a picture of two children, a boy and a girl, their smiles mirroring each other, their faces alight with a joy that felt both familiar and impossibly distant. "We were so young," Julian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He ran a finger across the image, his touch gentle, almost reverent. I barely remember this." Anya leaned closer, her breath misting in the cool air. The girl in the photograph, her, was a reflection of the woman she had become, yet simultaneously a stranger. The shared genetics were undeniable, the chasm between their lives painfully vast. "I remember fragments," Anya replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Glimmers of a life that was stolen from me, a life we both lost. But I see you in those eyes. The same stubborn streak, the same intensity. A wave of shared understanding, hesitant yet undeniable, passed between them. The weight of their fractured past, the complicated present, and the uncertain future pressed down on them. Yet, in that shared silence, in the shared gaze at the photograph, something shifted. The impossible had happened. They were bound, not just by blood, but by a growing understanding of the shared trauma and the incredible journey ahead of them. A journey toward healing and a future built on something more solid than rivalry. The scent of coffee, the ticking clock, the faint glow of city lights were mere accessories to the bond that was solidifying between two long-lost souls. The sprawling family estate, once a symbol of their fractured past, now felt strangely neutral. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the sunroom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden air. The scent of lilies, Anya's favorite, hung heavy, a deliberate choice by Julian, a silent gesture of reconciliation. He poured 2 glasses of iced tea, the clinking of ice a fragile counterpoint to the weight of their unspoken anxieties. "This place," Anya began, her voice hesitant, barely a whisper above the gentle hum of the air conditioner. She traced a finger along the worn mahogany armrest of a plush armchair, her gaze distant. The memories, she knew, lay just beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. Julian watched her, his heart aching with a mixture of guilt and burgeoning hope. He understood her reluctance, her guardedness. He, too, felt the weight of the past, the years of separation, the unspoken hurts. "It's different now," he offered softly, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I see it differently. I see us differently." Anya turned, her eyes, dark pools reflecting the light, met his. A flicker of something akin to forgiveness, or at least understanding, danced in their depths. The years of resentment, of bitterness, didn't vanish entirely, but they softened, their edges blurred by a nascent empathy. "Different how?" she asked, her voice still low, but firmer now, a hint of defiance clinging to the edges of her words. He hesitated, searching for the right words that could adequately convey the monumental shift in his perspective, the profound change in his heart. "I see the choices my father made, the terrible injustice of it all. I see how much you've overcome, how much strength you possess. And I understand, truly understand, the pain it caused you." A tear escaped Anya's eye, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, not entirely. It was a tear of release, of acknowledgement, of finally being seen. She reached out, her hand covering his, her touch tentative but firm. "It's a start," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A small step, but a start." The weight of the past remained, a shadow lingering at the edges, but for the first time, the light seemed to be winning. The future, once shrouded in uncertainty, now held a glimmer of shared hope, a promise of a bond forged not just in blood, but in the crucible of shared trauma and hard-won understanding. The scent of old paper and polished wood hung in the air of Anya's office, a stark contrast to the sleek modernity of Julian's headquarters. He sat opposite her, the mahogany desk a silent barrier between them, yet somehow less imposing than before. Sunlight slanted through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The merger documents, Julian began, his voice hesitant, his eyes avoiding hers. He pushed a thick file across the polished surface. The weight of it felt symbolic, the weight of their shared future. Anya picked up the file, its leather cool against her fingertips. She didn't open it immediately, instead letting her gaze drift to the cityscape visible through the window, a sprawling tapestry of lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled. The city that had witnessed their rivalry, their conflict, now held the promise of their shared triumph. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. The years of competition, of resentment, still lingered, a ghost in the room. But something had shifted. The anger, once sharp and unwavering, had mellowed, replaced by a cautious hope, a tentative trust. "It's a lot," Anya finally said, her voice low, almost a murmur. She opened the file, the crisp paper rustling softly. The detailed legal jargon swam before her eyes, but her focus wasn't on the specifics. It was on Julian, on the man sitting opposite her, once her enemy, now her sister. He watched her, a mixture of hope and apprehension etched on his face. The casual confidence that had once been his hallmark was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that both unnerved and captivated her. He'd shed the armor of his privilege, revealing a man wrestling with his past, seeking redemption. "I know," he said softly, his voice raspy. "It's not just a business deal, is it? It's everything." Anya nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of relief, of acceptance, of finally seeing the path towards forgiveness. "It is," she whispered, her gaze meeting his. The weight of the past was still there, but now it felt lighter, less overwhelming. The future, once uncertain, held a glimmer of hope, a shared vision, a new beginning. The boardroom hummed with nervous energy. The scent of expensive coffee mingled with the faint aroma of Anya's sandalwood perfume, a subtle counterpoint to the sterile scent of Julian's usually pristine office. He nervously adjusted his tie, the silk cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the sweat beading on his forehead. The merger was finalized, but the true test lay in the integration of their vastly different corporate cultures. "This isn't about numbers, Julian," Anya said, her voice firm but laced with a weariness that mirrored his own. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected in her dark eyes, making them seem deeper, more knowing. "It's about people." He nodded, his gaze drifting to the panoramic view of the city sprawled before them. The lights twinkled, a beautiful, chaotic display, much like the merger itself. "I know, and I'm scared." The admission surprised him, escaping before he could censor it. The vulnerability hung in the air, a fragile thing between them. Anya's lips curved into a small, understanding smile. "We both are, but we're doing this together." Remember, the memory of their shared trauma, the pain that had initially driven them apart, now served as a strange, unbreakable bond. A soft knock at the door interrupted their moment. Their shared lawyer, Ms. Chun, entered, her face etched with concern. "There's been a setback," she announced, her voice tight. "The SEC is investigating a potential conflict of interest regarding a pre-merger acquisition by your company, Julian." A cold dread snaked through Julian. He could feel Anya stiffen beside him. This was more than a setback. It was a threat to everything they'd fought for. Years of success, a carefully built empire, threatened by a ghost from his past. He knew Anya's gaze was on him, waiting, not with accusation this time, but with a question hanging heavy in the silence. A question that spoke not of blame, but of shared responsibility, shared fate. The weight of it was almost unbearable. The SEC investigation hung over them like a storm cloud, threatening to unleash its fury at any moment. The opulent boardroom, usually a symbol of their shared success, felt claustrophobic. Anya's usually sharp gaze was clouded with worry, her fingers drumming a restless rhythm on the mahogany table. The scent of sandalwood, usually comforting, now felt heavy, almost suffocating. Julian, usually composed, felt the familiar tightness in his chest, a knot of fear twisting tighter with each passing second. He pushed his chair back, the metallic screech jarring in the sudden silence. The panoramic city view, once a source of pride, now seemed mocking, its glittering lights reflecting the uncertainty in his soul. "We'll face this together," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He met Anya's gaze, seeking reassurance, finding instead a mirroring anxiety. The shared trauma, the years of separate lives, seemed to shrink in significance compared to this shared threat. "Together," Anya repeated, her voice low. She leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Remember the bakery? The one near our old place?" A flicker of a shared memory warmed Julian. The bakery's aroma of cinnamon and sugar, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the window, a fleeting moment of childhood innocence, before their lives diverged so sharply. He closed his eyes, letting the memory soothe the raw edges of his fear. "Yes," he whispered, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "We used to sneak extra cookies." Anya chuckled, a soft, breathy sound that eased the tension in the room. "And always got caught." The lightness of her tone was deceptive, the underlying current of determination unwavering. She straightened, her posture regaining its usual strength. "This isn't a few stolen cookies, Julian. This is our life's work. But we built it together, and we'll fight for it, together." Miss Chun entered again, a file in her hand. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, fluttered in Julian's chest. "I've found something," she said, her voice hesitant. "A discrepancy in the acquisition paperwork. A minor oversight, easily explained." Relief washed over them, a wave of shared triumph amidst the storm. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, they felt a glimmer of hope, a renewed strength born not just from shared ambition, but from a newfound, unbreakable bond. The city lights outside twinkled, no longer mocking, but promising. The celebratory dinner was a blur of clinking glasses and forced smiles. The air, thick with the scent of expensive champagne and simmering tension, mirrored the state of Anya and Julian's relationship. Anya, in a shimmering emerald gown, felt the weight of her newfound success pressing down on her. The merger had been a victory, but the cost, the exhaustion, the compromises was palpable. Julian, across the table, looked tired, the usual gleam in his eye dulled. He raised his glass. "To family," he said, his voice husky. Anya met his gaze, a flicker of something akin to tenderness softening the sharp edges of her usual reserve. "To family," she echoed, her voice a low murmur. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared history, their contrasting pasts finally converging. She saw the vulnerability in his eyes, a vulnerability she had only glimpsed before, hidden beneath layers of privilege and self-assuredness. Later, in the quiet solitude of her penthouse apartment, Anya stared out at the glittering cityscape. The city that had once felt like a battlefield, a place of relentless competition, now felt different, softer somehow. The success tasted sweeter knowing it was shared, not conquered alone. She picked up a framed photograph, a faded picture of a younger Julian and herself, two children clutching a single half-eaten cookie. A smile touched her lips, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, warming the chill that had settled in her heart over so many years. The past, once a wound that constantly bled, was starting to heal, leaving behind the faintest of scars, a reminder of their journey, their shared history, a testament to the strength of their newly found family. She reached for her phone, dialing Julian's number. "I thought we could order in pizza," she said when he answered, "and watch that awful movie we both secretly love." His laughter, warm and full, filled the silence of her apartment, a symphony of joy and healing. The future was still unwritten, the path ahead uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Anya felt a sense of peace, of hope, and most importantly, of belonging. He raised his glass. To family, he said, his voice husky. Anya met his gaze, a flicker of something of her usual reserve. To family, she echoed, her voice a low murmur. The word hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared history. Their contrasting pasts finally converged. Vulnerability in his eyes, a vulnerability she had only glimpsed before, hidden beneath layers of privilege and self-assuredness. Later, in the quiet solitude of her penthouse apartment, Anya stared out at the glittering city that had once felt like a battlefield, a place of relentless competition, now felt different, softer somehow. The success tasted sweeter knowing it was shared, not conquered alone. She picked up a framed photograph, was starting to heal, leaving behind the faintest of scars. That awful movie we both secretly love. But for the first time in a long time, Anya felt a sense of peace. Of her usual reserve. To family, voice a low murmur. The word hung in the air. Their contrasting a battlefield, a place of relentless competition, felt different, softer somehow. The success, knowing it was shared, not conquered alone. Was starting to heal, faintest of scars. But for the first time in a long a place of relentless competition, felt different, softer somehow. The success, knowing it was shared, not conquered alone. was starting to heal, of scars. But for the first time in a long